Well, hello. My name's Adrian Gilbert, and I'd like to welcome you to this channel. If you haven't been here before, what you might call an esotericist. I'm very, very interested in ancient mysteries, forgotten history, and in this occasion I'm researching deeply into the book of Revelations in the Bible, which is the last book in the Bible, which is all about the end of the age. And I am actually quite convinced that we're living through that. So that's quite an important subject to be looking into, because there's various prophecies about what's going to happen. But there's more to it than that. It's not just a book of prophecies or a book of mysterious imagery. It's actually a kind of document that tells us a lot about what's going on in the unseen worlds. And it's probably the major book for understanding the esoteric, the more secret side of Christianity. And you need to understand here, and I've done a whole lecture on this, that St. John himself, who wrote this book, was probably the most mystical of Jesus' 12 apostles. He witnessed a lot of things that most of the others didn't. And he also lived to a great age. He was probably around about 90 when he died. So there's a lot of wisdom in there, packed in amidst the sort of frightening imagery for what is going to happen at the end of time, the end of the age. Anyway, so what's this all about? Well, I've entitled this lecture "The Lamb of God," and you'll see why as we go on. And to begin here, it says at the start of chapter 5 of the Revelation, John is still observing the court of God. Here there is a dilemma concerning who is worthy to carry out a great deed. Excuse me. So what's this all about? Well, the previous chapter, and I hope you've listened to my earlier lecture on that one. I'm doing a whole series, as I said, on these. You'll find them all on YouTube. The situation was that we saw the throne of God, when I linked this to being the North Pole of the Earth and what happens there, and the connection of that between the time cycles of the Earth, the daily cycle and the annual cycle. And now we come to a situation where, symbolically speaking, John is seeing these elders debating among themselves what's to be done. And their problem is that there's a scroll that needs to be opened. Now, I'm just going to read you out the beginning of the chapter 5. Then I saw in the right hand of him who was seated on the throne, that's to say God, a scroll written within, and on the back sealed with 7 seals. And I saw a strong angel proclaiming with a loud voice, "Who is worthy to open the scroll and break its seals?" And no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth was able to open the scroll or to look into it. And I began to weep loudly, because no one was found worthy to open the scroll or to look into it. And one of the elders said to me, "Weep no more. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has conquered, so that he can open the scroll and its 7 seals." So we're given to understand that there's a scroll. It might look something like this, and we're going to talk about that in the next chapter. A scroll with 7 seals on it, and there's no one around there that is worthy enough. I mean, in other words, has the authority to open the seals. I mean, I'm sure that, yeah, they could open it, but the whole thing about something being sealed is that it's to stop the unworthy from opening it. Now, I made this up myself with sealing wax and a piece of paper, but those of you who are a bit older, like me, I guess, may remember that we used to use sealing wax quite a lot when we were kids, especially for parcels at Christmas time. You put sealing wax on string, sometimes on letters, and you might even have a special ring with embossed so that you could press it into the sealing wax to seal it with your initials. That's called a signet ring. It's a ring for signing. That's what signet means. It's a signing ring, and people used to do that in the old days. I'm not that old, but people used to do that a little bit when I was a kid, mostly sealing up parcels for Christmas. I don't think you see sealing wax very much now, if at all. But the idea was that you seal it, and then if someone tries to open it, they break the seal, and then the person who's receiving that knows that their mail has been tampered with, and there could be serious repercussions for that. So only the person who is authorized to break the seal, who has the authority to do so, is allowed to open it. And this is the situation. And it reminds me a bit of this situation here. I'm a big fan of the King Arthur story and the whole business. And it begins with Arthur, this boy who's been brought up, by Sir Kay and his Sir Ector and his son Kay, and Arthur's, there's this sword that Merlin has put in a stone, and the idea is that only the person who can become the next king of Britain can draw the sword from the stone. And of course, everyone's gathered together. All the knights are gathered together in London to have a go at pulling the sword out of the stone, and none of them can do it. But Sir Kay has forgotten to bring his sword with him, and he says, "Oh, can you get me a sword?" And Arthur goes around, he sees this sword in the stone, so he just pulls it out and hands it to Sir Kay, and Sir Kay recognizes it, and he says, "Yeah, I've got the sword," But of course, he can't put it back in and take it out. And eventually, they discover that it actually was this squire Arthur who had pulled the sword out of the stone, that he is indeed the true king of Britain. So it's a bit like that with this whole thing of who is worthy to open the seal, who is going to reveal everything that's contained in the scroll. So I've written down some notes here. The dilemma of the book. And I saw a strong angel proclaim with a loud voice, "Who is worthy to open the book and to loose the seals thereof?" Also, no man in heaven, nor on earth, nor under the earth, was able to open the book, neither to look thereon. And this is a situation at the start of Revelation 5. It's a situation of stasis. The book that is referred to is the one which Daniel was told to shut up and seal. Now, I'll just say a few words about that. There's another book, which I'm going to do some lectures on this one as well, but in the Old Testament, the book of Daniel, which has a lot of prophecies, both for the period of the ages. Many of these prophecies have already come true, but there are also prophecies for the end of time, the end of the age. And Daniel is told to seal them up in a book, and that it won't be opened, and no one will understand it. People go hither and thither, and knowledge will increase. And eventually it will have to be opened, but not in his time. And he was living in the 6th century BC. So that's more than 2,500 years ago. So that book's been sealed up for a long time. But St. John, I believe, and I've said this in one of my earlier lectures, I believe that St. John was actually the reincarnation of Daniel. Now, if you're a Christian, you throw your hands up and horror, how can you talk about reincarnation? That's not a Christian thing. Well, Jesus actually said himself that John the Baptist was the reincarnation of Elias, the prophet who rose to heaven in the Old Testament. He's the most major prophet of the Old Testament. And Jesus said, that an Elijah is supposed to come along and clear the way for the Messiah. And Jesus says that, and people say, well, where is Elijah? If you're going to be the Messiah, where's Elijah? And Jesus said he's already been and gone. He was John the Baptist. So you might say, oh, well, he's just talking symbolic. No, he's not. You study the story of Elijah and John, you see extraordinary parallels in their lives and the way that they were. And my other argument about reincarnation is that if I were God, and this is a digression, right? But if I were God and I were issuing out souls, I'm putting them onto the earth and they're going into bodies, and some of them are going to go into wonderful, nice families, yeah, lovely religious families that take them to church, teach them the Ten Commandments, bring them up well, they live good lives, eventually they die and they go to heaven. And then there are other souls who go into horrible situations, yeah, the poverty-stretched family. The father's a thief. He teaches the son to be a thief too, and he gets beaten up, and he turns into a wretch. He turns into a horrible person himself, and he's going to go to hell, isn't he? But if you've only got one shot, that's very unfair on the part of God, is it not? But if it's a situation where you're having a series of lives, some going to be in good situations, others you're going to be in bad situations, others in mediocre situations. You're going to be a servant in one life, you might be a courtier in another, you might be a king even. And another time you might find yourself, starving. There's all these different situations on earth. And through those different situations, you're going to learn more and develop. And my feeling is that if God can put a soul into a baby once, right? Because you don't think that soul comes from the mother and father. If you're a Christian, you believe it comes from God. But if he can do it once, why can he not send it many times into different babies at different times to have different experiences? So it makes sense to me that we live many lives, and I should be going into this in other lectures, but I just thought I'd throw that in now, that I do believe that John was the reincarnation of Daniel. So it would be only fitting that he would have this vision, which we call the apocalypse, where he's seeing the seals being opened on the book which he wasn't allowed to know about what was in it when he was Daniel. And that's another indication towards the end of days. Anyway, let's carry on with this. And it said here that, but you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. Well, we run to and fro all the time now, don't we? We're flying on planes. We go off for a stag weekend in Prague one day, and you might be on a beach in Madrid the next. Not Madrid, in the Costa Brava the next. Or you might be flying to America. Who knows? We go to and fro. Knowledge, has never been so much knowledge. But libraries and libraries full of books. People doing experiments all the time. There's more scientists alive today than have ever been alive in all of history. So the whole thing about knowledge increasing and people moving around, well, it's got to be our time, hasn't it? And just look at the world. Can it go on much further as it's carrying on now? So anyway, let's carry on with this. Now, as I discussed in the last lecture, St. John is observing the reality of the earth and its cycles and daily cycle, and the annual cycle, symbolized as elders and beasts. He also sees the aurora borealis as the manifestation of the Logos. What am I talking about here? Well, there's a description of the throne of God, and it talks about how there's a sea of ice. Well, the place where there's a sea of ice is the North Pole. And it talks about the God being, or his throne, the being on it, being this green and red stones, this carnelian and agate. That those are the colours actually of the Northern Lights. So everything points towards the Northern Lights. But I've done that in the previous lecture. You can watch that and know more about this. And we see how the four beasts around the throne represent the four fixed signs of the zodiac, the lion, the bull, the man, and they use an eagle instead of a scorpion. The sign of Aquila the eagle is not that far from Scorpio. So there's only one deemed worthy to open the book it's the lamb, right? So I'm going to go on here with what it says here. And between the throne and the 4 living creatures and among the elders, I saw a lamb standing, as though it had been slain, with 7 horns and with 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God, sent out into all the earth. And he went and took the scroll from the right hand of him who was seated on the throne. And when he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each holding a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. And they sang a new song, saying, Worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals. For you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God, from every tribe and language and people and nation. And you have made them a kingdom and priests to our God, and they shall reign on earth. So what's this all about? What's this lamb all about? Well, of course it's talking about Jesus, isn't it? But I want to show you some things which I discovered, which I think are rather relevant to all of this. First of all, there's the symbolism of the lamb and as being, or Jesus as being the Son of God who's slain for the sins of man. Well, this is a kind of repeating in a way of in the Old Testament when Abraham is told to take his son Isaac and sacrifice him, and he's about to sacrifice him because he has to obey the word of God. God has told him, I want you to sacrifice your only son, the most precious thing that Abraham has. And Abraham's obedient to God, and he's going to do the deed. And then an angel comes along and says, "No, stop! That was just a test." And Abraham finds a lamb caught up in a thicket, and he's told to sacrifice that instead. So he does. So there's this sacrificial lamb, and that's supposed to have happened on Mount Moriah, which is in Jerusalem, on where the Temple Mount, so-called, is. Actually, the temple wasn't built there, but that's another story. That's where Mount Moriah is, and the peak of that is actually the rock, which you'll see is under the dome of the rock. The mosque there that's so contentious in Israel between the Jews and the Palestinians, that whole area is very contentious. That's supposed to be where Abraham was going to slay his son Isaac. Although in the Muslim tradition, they substitute Isaac for Ishmael, who was the other son of Abraham by the bondwoman. Well, okay. But Abraham was going to slay his son, let's just put it that way. So that's the first reference we have here to this whole slaying. And then we have another one, which is the Last Supper, which Jesus suffered just before he was crucified. You remember that the crucifixion takes place in Jerusalem, and they have this Last Supper where he gets together with his disciples, and he breaks bread and does all of that. And then he goes out in the garden, and that's where he's arrested. Judas betrays him with a kiss, and he's arrested and taken to the high priest, and he's flogged, and he's taken to the Romans, and eventually the Romans, decide that it's going to be more trouble than it's worth. The Jews want this guy out of the way, let's get rid of him. So they decide they're going to crucify him, and Pilate washes his hands. Well, the Last Supper takes place on the Thursday, as we would put it. We have Maundy Thursday is the day connected with that. Then we have Good Friday, which is the crucifixion. We have Holy Saturday, and eventually Easter Sunday with the resurrection. Right, so these are all feasts to do with that. But the original Passover feast, when the Last Supper was celebrating, was connected with the angel passing over. So the Last Supper was the feast of the Passover. This celebrated the occasion when the Israelites were finally freed from to make their exodus from Egypt. Angels were sent to Egypt to slay the firstborn of the Egyptians. And the Israelites were instructed to sacrifice a lamb, there must be lots of lambs, and smear the blood on their door frames. and the angels would then see the mark and pass over their houses. So this is something that's very important still in Judaism, is this idea that God told them to slay the lamb and put the blood on the door frame, and the angels passed over their houses, slaying the firstborn of the Egyptians, including the Pharaoh's own first son. And because of that, that was the last one of the 10 plagues of Israel. And then the Israelites, the Pharaoh said, okay, go away, you caused me enough trouble. So that's when they were freed. And they still celebrate that feast. And this is what the feast that the Last Supper was celebrating. So we have again this thing about the sacrificial lamb that saves the people. So that's part of it. But there's much more to it than that, as I've discovered. Now, I'm just going to read out what I've written here. There's more to the crucifixion story than meets the eye. To understand this, first we must establish the correct chronology. A crucial date is established in the Gospel of John, near the beginning, at the start of Jesus' ministry. He debates with the Jews in the temple. The conversation is as follows. Jesus answered and said unto them, Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. They then said the Jews, 46 years was the temple in building, and wilt thou raise it in 3 days? But he spoke of the temple of the body. Now, this is important because it gives us a kind of time frame to know when Jesus was actually teaching. And the first thing to know is that his ministry begins with his baptism in the Jordan River by John. And then he goes off and he does his initial teaching, and within this first year of his teaching is when he confronts these elders in the temple and talks about he'll pull it down and rebuild it. So if we can find that year, then we're on to something. So the second temple was begun by King Herod in 20 BC. That's the Herod, who slew the babies, and wanted to kill Jesus and talk to the wise men and so on. 46 years later brings us to AD 26. Jesus began his ministry with his baptism in the Jordan. This is the original feast of Christmas and took place on the 6th of January. So Jesus' ministry began in 26 AD. It lasted 3 years, so his crucifixion must have taken place in 29 AD. So I want you to get this picture. Christmas was not originally celebrated, and this might surprise you, it wasn't celebrated as the birth of the baby Jesus. It was actually celebrated on what we would call Old Christmas, which would be the 6th of January now because the calendar's been shifted. But what they celebrate as Old Christmas, still in the Eastern Orthodox churches on the 6th of January, was originally the feast of the baptism of Jesus. The Epiphanes means manifestation. And it was the manifestation of the light over the Jordan is what they celebrated. And they used to take water on that day and bless it, and they would use that for baptisms for the rest of the year. This was kind of how the early church behaved. I don't think they do the same thing now, but this was the idea. So, you wouldn't want to be baptized on the 5th of January with the old water from the previous year. You'd probably wait for the next 6th, and then you would do it. I don't know. But anyway, so they would bless the water for baptisms on that original Christmas. But then it got changed after the Roman Empire became Christian, and they shifted it to the 25th of December because that was the feast connected with the Saturnalia and with the birth of Mithras and the celebration of Sol Invictus, the sun being reborn after the winter solstice, these pagan feasts. So they kind of consolidated all that. So look, let's make it the birth of Jesus as a baby. Then all these pagans are going to feel comfortable. They can still celebrate their feast, and they can give presents to each other, and they can talk about Father Christmas. I'm joking. But they changed it. After a little while, they kind of forgot about the baptism in the Jordan being the original feast of that time. Anyway. So the Passover, now, so it's the 29th 29 AD is when we should be looking for the date of the crucifixion. Right, so I'm going to continue here. The Passover was celebrated on the first full moon after the spring equinox. And on that year, there was one just before the equinox. So the first after it was on what we would call the 14th of April, 29 AD. And the crucifixion would take place the next day on the 15th of April, 29 AD. So I know it's a little bit convoluted and it's a little bit sort of speculative, but we can work out and say with some clarity, and I think the Encyclopedia Britannica will back me up on this, by the way, that the crucifixion took place in 29 AD, and if that's the case, then it would be just after the first full moon after the equinox. And the first full moon after the equinox brings us round to Passover on the 14th, and the crucifixion the next day on the 15th. So we can now start having a look at the stars and how they were. So I've got here, using this date, 15th of April, AD 29, produces some extraordinary results that seem more than coincidental. First of all, we discover that on this day, the sun was positioned exactly under the last star of Aries. I can show you here. I hope you can see that clearly, but the last star, the last star of Aries is just above the sun. And Aries, of course, represents the sacrificial lamb. So we've got Jesus being crucified while the sun is in the last star, just before Aries is going to die, symbolically. So it's a question of the whole idea of as above, so below. This Hermetic dictum, which I've talked about before, this idea that the heavens portray what is happening on the earth in this extraordinary life of Jesus. And I've done other things on this. Actually, the baptism, I maybe should have shown you this, but the baptism, if we took the 26 AD for the baptism, and the sun, where it would be positioned on the 6th of January that year, using our terminology, the sun was positioned exactly under the hand of Aquarius the water bearer. You think of that as symbolizing St. John the Baptist, and there's the hand and the sun right under it in Aquarius. And just conjunct with it is actually the planet Venus, which is often linked with the dove. And we have the symbolism of the dove coming down at the baptism of Jesus. So again, this symbolism, as above, so below, would have applied then. So there's some very strange imagery associated with this whole crucifixion event of Jesus, this whole as above, so below thing. And I want to share with you some of this, some of the other things that I've discovered. And the first bit is in John, in chapter 19. And it describes how he's taken up for crucifixion. I'm just going to read that out to you briefly. So they took Jesus, and he went out, bearing his own cross, to the place called the place of a skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on either side, and Jesus between them. Pilate also wrote a title and put it on the cross. It read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Many of the Jews read this title, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, in Latin, and in Greek. The chief priests of the Jews then said to Pilate, Do not write the King of the Jews, but this man said, I am the King of the Jews. Pilate answered, What I have written, I have written. So we have that description. Jesus is taken up to this place of the skull, a small hill, very near, I believe. That now it's generally agreed that there's a place where they have what's called a garden tomb, which many people believe to be the real place where Jesus was buried, not in the church, what's now the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. And there is actually a little hill there which looks a bit like a skull. And that's where people are saying, yeah, that's where he was probably crucified. And I'd go along with that. But I want to show you something here with the stars. Now, we know from one of the other Gospels, I think it's Matthew, that tells us that Jesus was crucified at midday. They call it the 6th hour. Then he died at the 9th hour, it should be 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And we still celebrate that here, in Christendom. When I was a kid, we used to be taken to Mass. We'd go there and it would start at 12 and it wouldn't finish till 3 o'clock, which was when Jesus actually died. Now, curiously, at this very time, shortly before midday, the star Algol, which means in Arabic the skull, culminated exactly at the mid-heaven or zenith point in the sky in Jerusalem. Now, that's very curious because, imagine Jesus brought up to this hill, probably would have been about quarter to 12, 11:45. And then they're going to nail him on the cross, and strip him of his clothes, nail him on the cross, and put the cross upright. So you can see here that is where the mid-heaven point is, where there's a sort of cross on here. That would be the place exactly overhead, and that's where this star Algol is. And that star Algol, known as the skull, is supposedly represents the head of the Gorgon, Medusa, which is held aloft by Perseus in the Greek myths and turns everything to stone. Whoever looks at it, it's considered to be one of the most unlucky stars in the sky. And there it is, right overhead, when Jesus is brought to that hill called Golgotha, the hill of the skull. Strange. And then it goes on from that. At exactly noon local time, the sun is at its culmination point in the southern sky as it crosses the north-south meridian, right? So we can see there, it's underneath the last star of Aries, as I was saying earlier. There's the sun under that last star of Aries. But rising in the east at the same time is the constellation of Leo. And exactly at that time, when the sun's culminating in the south, which would be dead on noon, I know that the time scales are not quite right on these star charts because they're using standard times rather than actual local times exactly. But as that star crosses over the horizon, star Regulus, and the star Regulus means the little king star, and it's in Leo. Leo is the tribe of the constellation representative of the tribe of Judah. So this whole idea of the lion of the tribe of Judah, Judah's connected with Leo, the sign of Leo. And there's the most prominent star in Leo, which is known as Regulus, also called the Lionheart star, crossing over the horizon. And that's when they put the sign up over Jesus, saying, Jesus Christ, King of the Jews. It's uncanny. It's uncanny what's going on here. So at this moment, the Roman soldiers are putting up the sign that identifies Jesus as King of the Jews. In other words, Jesus is crucified as the Lion of the tribe of Judah. But this whole thing carries on. It's not just the crucifixion. I want us now to look at how this develops. There's the star Regulus, you can see there in the constellation of Leo. Now, on the third day, Easter, the day of Easter, something else is happening. Jesus rises at dawn, or just before the dawn, and curiously enough, constellation of Aries rises just before the dawn. In other words, the Lamb coming up over the horizon. And exactly overhead, again at the zenith point, where we had previously the skull of death, we now have the sign of the cross. Cygnus the Swan, the constellation of the Swan, is crossing overhead, but that constellation is also called the Northern Cross. And you can see why, because it's sort of like a cross shape. It's quite bright. So we have the symbol of the cross above and the lamb or Aries rising up over the horizon at dawn. And here we have Jesus coming out of his tomb, Roman soldiers falling asleep. And in paintings of the resurrection, it's usual to show Jesus emerging from the tomb while carrying the banner of victory. And that has the red cross on the white background that we would call the cross of St. George, but this is the cross of Christ. And the banner has the red cross on it, which seems to be esoterically emblematic of the position of the northern cross directly overhead at dawn on the first Easter. So this first Easter day, you can imagine like a pole going up, and there's the cross on the top. The pole going up, there's the cross on the top, which is Cygnus the Swan. And similarly, you had Jesus coming out of his tomb, holding the banner. But the symbolism goes further. The most prominent symbol for Easter is what's called the Agnus Dei, and it looks like this. There you have the lamb clutching with his hoof hooked around the banner with the cross on it. So again, this whole idea of Aries rising over the horizon, the lamb that's been slaughtered, holding aloft the banner. And interestingly, in this particular stained glass window, there's a couple of stars above there. I don't know how this has happened. You know, this is just extraordinary to me, that the symbolism of the crucifixion with the skull, the rising of Regulus, the star under the sun under the last star of Aries, then at Easter, Aries rising just before the dawn with the symbol of the cross overhead as a symbol of Easter, is just extraordinary. But it goes on further, and it carries on. Now, according to the Bible, on the 40th day of the resurrection, so Easter Sunday is the first, and this is the 40th day, brings us round to the feast of the Ascension. So Jesus stayed apparently with his disciples, giving them talk. He's meeting people, and and he could be in two places at once. The people that are up by Galilee, and he appears to them, and he cooks fish for them. Other times he's with his disciples in the upper chamber where they'd had the Last Supper, and he comes through the wall. That's kind of weird. And yet Thomas says, look, how do I know it's you? Let me put my fingers in the side to make sure it really is you. And he does. And so somehow this Jesus, and I know this is way beyond what we would believe is scientifically possible, but you've got to understand, we're talking about supernatural events here. The whole idea of religion is that it's supernatural. It's like the Matrix. You know, the Matrix, where Neo is able to sort of do things and sort of hold his hands up and the bullets just stop and then they fall to the ground. Do you remember that? Because he has control over this Matrix in which he is placed. And it's like that this material universe that we find ourselves in is the Matrix. And Jesus has come from some other higher dimension, and he has control over this physical world because of that. And so he can do things, and come through walls and appear and still be solid. Now he's supposedly ascending to heaven, and he apparently disappears in a cloud. Well, that also is very interesting, because I took the date of Easter in 29 AD, and I counted on to the 40th day. And guess where the sun was then? Well, it's right there, over the upstretched hand of Orion, which, if you've been following my earlier lectures, is where the Stargate is. Where this crossing point between the ecliptic and the median plane of the Milky Way, that people in ancient times believed was the gate of heaven. So we know about this. If you go back and look at my lecture on the gate of heaven, but it's talked about in Egypt in connection with the Osiris um, uh, idea that the Pharaoh died, he gets mummified, he's resurrected, and then he ascends and he goes to Orion through the gateway and he goes to join his father in Orion. Well, very, very peculiar this, that Jesus goes through this, what is effectively the Osirian mystery, if you look at it from the stars. He's murdered by his enemies on the cross. His body's taken down. He's wrapped up in the shroud. Incidentally, Shroud of Turin is an extraordinary object. It's often dismissed, oh, it must be a fake. Probably Leonardo da Vinci painted it or something. Well, it's not. I mean, the threads there, it's made of linen, and the threads are actually burnt. They're like toast. It's been burnt with that image on it. And how the hell would you do that? It's, it's beyond belief, isn't it? And when they've done 3D studies of it, it does reveal this crucified man. And who else could it be but Jesus? But again, another supernatural event. But I find it extraordinary. He's wrapped up in this shroud like a mummy. He resurrects, comes out of his tomb, and then he ascends. And where does he go to? Well, the sun indicates, just as it was under the last star of Aries at the Crucifixion, it's now over the hand of Orion, the ascension position. That is, to me, that is just extraordinary. I'll leave it with you. You might think this is all just total coincidence, and it doesn't matter. Forget it, Adrian. It probably is crucified in 27 AD or 32 or something. No. This has meaning. At least it does to me, and I hope it does for you as well, because it's indicating that what we take for granted as being just cause and effect material world that we live in actually is subject to something higher. It's subject to the conditions of what a higher level world can make of it. And it's unbelievable. It's incredible that the star positions even, and the mythology that goes with those star positions, and the ancient teachings about them, kind of mirror the whole story of the crucifixion, the death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus, just as in an Assyrian mystery. I find that totally extraordinary, and it gives me more reason to want to know about the revelation and what that might be going to tell us about our own time. So now we have the symbolism of the Lamb who's going to open, as I said, the sealed up document, and that's going to be in the next chapter. But what I want to draw your attention to here is this lamb that has 7 horns and 7 eyes. And what's that all about? Well, I didn't mention it in the last lecture. Maybe I should have done that. It says there that before the throne of God, there are the 7 spirits of God there. And now the lamb is placed, doesn't talk about 7 spirits anymore, it's talking about the lamb. But the lamb has the 7 horns and the 7 eyes. It's that the lamb is now is the embodiment of the 7 spirits. And as I told you in an earlier lecture, the word spirit comes from spiritus, which means breath. But it's not just, it's actually the breath that carries the word, the logos of God. God creates through logos. He gives commands. Let there be light. Let there be man on the earth. This gives commands. And those commands are carried on his breath. Symbolically, his breath is energy flow through the universe. Probably we're talking more about some kind of electricity. But that is what the Holy Ghost is. The Holy Ghost is not a phantom bird that's flying around. It's the manifestation of the breath of God, and that's carrying the commands of God that makes things happen. Now, I know if you're an atheist and you think I'm a complete nutcase because you follow the teachings of Dawkins or whoever. Okay, but try to explain how we live in this extremely complex universe and how we have this body which is far more complex than any kind of machine. And yet you would claim that this has kind of arisen, lifted itself up by its own bootstraps from the mud of the earth and evolved to just become this willy-nilly through chance. No, no. We can't even make so much as this without designing it and making it happen. How can you think that so much as a fly is not designed? It's crazy. So we now have the symbol of the Lamb with the 7 rays coming out of his head as 7 horns, and the 7 eyes. He sees everything, and he is now the one who is going to have the authority because of what he's been through, because he has linked himself with the Logos. And this is again what these 7 horns is all about, is that the Lamb, which is Jesus, of course, Jesus, who's through by coming to Christ and obeying the commandments of God, he has realigned his own will with the will of his Father. And he says this in the Bible. He says, "Not my will, thy will." And this is the problem that we have, that we are willful and we do all the wrong stuff. We're the sorcerer's apprentices on this planet. We kind of mess it all up. So we need someone from higher up to come and sort it out for us and to show us the way and to get us realigned ourselves back to the Word of God, the Logos, and the breath of God coming through us, which will give us eternal life. And I'm going to talk about that in other lectures, but this is what that's all about. And because he's been through that and he's achieved that, this giving up his own will and joining his will to the will of the Father, he now has the authority to open the 7 seals. And we'll be discussing that in the next lecture. So that's the end of this lecture. Thank you very much for tuning in and listening, and I hope you found it interesting and were able to understand what I was saying. It is important, and it does show that this whole symbolism of the lamb holding the flag, is terribly important, and it is actually the essence of the conquering nature of Jesus Christ as the Savior of this world. And as I said, I'm not into big hat religion. I'm not into guys who wear robes and say, "Let me give you a blessing, my son," when they've done nothing really of any worth themselves. And who knows, they might be abusing choir boys on the side. I'm talking to you about the real Christianity, the esoteric Christianity, the Christianity that requires you to do the stuff, you to find the truth, and you to try to align yourself and your will through the example and the help of the Jesus Spirit to get back in track with the will of the Father, which is what we should be doing at this late hour. Thank you very much again.